It was 1990. Two criminologists published the results of 17 years of participant observation inside outlaw motorcycle clubs. What they found about the women in that world was consistent across every club they studied. The rules that governed an old lady's life were never written down and never formally explained. But every woman who had spent any significant time inside that world knew them completely. Here are the ones nobody was supposed to talk about. The term did not start with bikers. In 1947, thousands of motorcyclists descended on the small California town of Hollister over the 4th of July weekend. What followed was 3 days of drinking, racing, and disorder that made national headlines and permanently cemented the image of the outlaw biker in the American imagination. A photograph published in Life magazine showing a disheveled rider surrounded by beer bottles became one of the most reproduced images in motorcycle club history. But buried inside that moment was something else entirely. A culture with its own language and its own very specific way of talking about women. The term old lady did not originate in a motorcycle clubhouse. It came from the streets of early 20th century working class America, where men called their wives and long-term partners their old lady as a matter of ordinary language. It was not romantic. It was blue-collar and direct in the way that working-class speech has always been. My old lady meant my woman. The person I am with. The person whose problems are mine and whose conduct reflects on me. When outlaw motorcycle clubs began forming in California after World War II, the men who built them brought that language with them. Most of them were veterans from working-class backgrounds, where old lady was already the standard term for the woman in a man's life. Therefore, when the clubs absorbed the language, it already fit the culture they were building. Rough, unsentimental, built around loyalty and obligation rather than romance. But inside the club world, the term evolved into something the original working-class slang never was. It became a rank. Calling a woman your old lady in 1920 Chicago meant she was your partner. Calling a woman your old lady in a 1960s Hells Angels chapter meant she was your partner. She was off limits to every other man in the organization, and she carried the weight of your reputation every time she walked into a room full of members. That evolution from casual slang to formal designation happened gradually and differently across different clubs. But by the time the major outlaw clubs had established themselves as permanent institutions in American criminal culture, the term had acquired a weight that its origins never carried. An old lady in the MC world was not just a girlfriend. She was a position, and positions in that world had to be earned. The Hells Angels once had female members. In 1957, Sonny Barger founded the Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels. The club he built in those early years was rougher and less structured than the organization it would eventually become. But it had one characteristic that has been almost entirely erased from its public history. It accepted women as full-patch members. Female members were rare, but they existed. They patched in and wore the death head alongside male members inside the organization that would go on to become the most powerful outlaw motorcycle club in the world. That changed in 1964. Barger imposed a rule making the Hells Angels male only. His justification was practical. Female members were less able to defend themselves against rival bikers who might try to steal their patches. In the world the Angels inhabited, a member who could not physically defend their patch was a liability to the entire chapter. Therefore, women were out. But the consequence of that single decision extended far beyond the Hells Angels. By 1964, the Angels had already established themselves as the dominant outlaw motorcycle club in America. What they did, other clubs followed. The male-only rule became the template that every major outlaw club adopted in the years that followed, all tracing that exclusion back to a decision made in Oakland in 1964. The organization that defined what an outlaw motorcycle club looked like had spent its first 17 years permitting female membership. The exclusion came later, imposed by one man, for reasons argued at the time as practical rather than discriminatory. But what replaced female membership was something far more complicated. Women did not disappear from the Hells Angels world after 1964. They remained central to it. But the terms of their presence changed entirely. They went from members with patches and votes to a separate category whose status was entirely dependent on the man they were attached to. The old lady system that defined women's roles in outlaw clubs for the next 6 decades was not the original design. It was the replacement for something that had existed before it and been deliberately removed. What old lady actually means inside the club? Most people who hear the term old lady assume it is simply biker slang for girlfriend, a casual nickname with no particular significance beyond the relationship itself. But that assumption misses almost everything that actually matters about what the term means inside an outlaw motorcycle club. An old lady is a rank, not a membership rank in the way that prospect or full patch are ranks, but a designated position within the social structure of the club that comes with its own rules, its own protections, and its own consequences. And like every other rank in that world, it has to be earned. It cannot be assumed, claimed, or self-assigned. It is conferred by the member she is with and recognized by the club as a whole. If the club does not recognize it, the title does not exist, regardless of how long she has been with him. The recognition process varies by club and by chapter. Some chapters have formal timelines. A president interviewed on the subject described his rule as requiring a minimum period of committed relationship before a woman could be acknowledged as an old lady regardless of how the member felt about her. But other chapters make a collective assessment based on observation at events and runs. In every case, the determination is made by the club, not by the member, not by the woman. If she earns the title, she becomes off limits to every other member in the organization. That protection is absolute, and the consequences for violating it are severe. A member who approaches another man's old lady with anything beyond ordinary courtesy risks expulsion after a beating the club itself sanctions. But the rule exists not out of respect for the woman. It exists out of respect for the member she belongs to. She is an extension of him. Disrespecting her is disrespecting him. But that protection cuts both ways. If she behaves badly at a club event, the embarrassment falls on him. If she creates tension with another member's old lady, that becomes his problem to resolve. He is responsible for her conduct in the same way he is responsible for his own. Therefore, in the eyes of the organization, they are a single unit. The members themselves describe the best old ladies in almost identical terms, regardless of which club or which era they are speaking from. The one who never has to be told anything twice. The one who reads the room before the room has to explain itself to her. If she gets that right, her man looks stronger inside the organization. But if she gets it wrong, the consequences land on him, not on her. That combination of loyalty and discretion is what separates an old lady from a girlfriend. And in that world, the distance between those two things is considerable. 4. The property patch and what it actually means. In 2009, 2 criminologists named James Quinn and Craig Forsyth presented a research paper at the annual meetings of the Mid-South Sociological Association in Lafayette, Louisiana. The paper was called Biker Women, and it was one of the first serious academic attempts to document how women actually functioned inside outlaw motorcycle club culture. What it found contradicted almost everything the popular image of biker women suggested. The property patch was at the center of it. To anyone outside the MC world, a patch that reads property followed by a club name looks like exactly what it sounds like: a declaration of ownership, a woman reduced to an object, something that belongs to a man the way a motorcycle or a piece of equipment belongs to him. That reading is not entirely wrong. But it is not the complete picture either, and understanding what the patch actually means inside the culture requires understanding the world it operates in. The Hells Angels and the Outlaws both use the same system. A patched old lady wears a top rocker identifying her as property of, and a bottom rocker listing the club name. The Bandidos use a similar system for what they call their main old lady. The Pagans provide no patches for women at all. But across every club that uses the property patch, the function is identical. It is a signal to every other man in that world that she is spoken for, that she carries the protection of the club behind her, and that anyone who treats her as available is making a serious mistake. If the property patch sounds like protection, that is because inside that world, it is. A woman wearing that patch at a club event, a run, or any gathering where multiple clubs are present is operating under a level of protection that no unattached woman in that environment has. The patch is a warning. It tells every man in the room what the consequences of disrespecting her would be. And in a world where consequences are enforced physically and without appeal, that warning carries genuine weight. But here is what the patch also means that the protection framing obscures. The woman wearing it has accepted the terms of that world completely. She has agreed to be identified as belonging to a specific man and a specific club. She has agreed to conduct herself according to the club's expectations in every public setting. She has agreed that her behavior reflects on his patch and therefore on the club itself. The patch is not just a declaration of his claim on her. It is a declaration of her acceptance of everything that claim entails. Therefore, when women who have left that world describe the property patch, they tend to describe it in two ways simultaneously, as something that made them feel genuinely protected in an environment that was genuinely dangerous, and as something that made them feel the full weight of what they had agreed to in ways they had not fully understood when they agreed to it. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the distance between them is where most of the complexity of what it means to be an old lady in an outlaw motorcycle club actually lives. Not every club treats her the same way. One of the most common misconceptions about old ladies in outlaw motorcycle clubs is that the culture is uniform. It is not. The differences between how major clubs treat their old ladies are significant enough that the experience of being an old lady in one club bears almost no resemblance to the experience in another. The Hells Angels keep old ladies at a deliberate distance from club business. They attend events and are present at runs. But the internal life of the chapter happens in spaces she is not permitted to enter. If a member needs to have a private conversation and his old lady is standing nearby, he does not lower his voice. He moves. She exists in a parallel world that runs alongside the club without ever intersecting with it. The property patch she wears identifies her publicly as belonging to a specific member. But the protection that patch represents is conditional on his standing inside the organization, not on anything she has built independently. The bandidos use a different designation. Their old ladies are formally known as Proud Bandido Old Ladies, or PBOLs. A former PBOL, who wrote about her experience, described the dynamic precisely. Every part of a woman's club affiliation is on loan to her by her bandido. The patches, the standing, the access. He can take all of it away whenever he chooses. She knew that going in, but knowing it and experiencing it, as she put it, are much different things. Texas Monthly documented the unwritten rules that bandidos old ladies were expected to follow. Help keep their man and his motorcycle in good order. Never gossip about club members when women gather together. Above all, obedience, cleanliness, and truthfulness. The rules had apparently never been written down before. The men in the yard laughed when they were told what the project was. To them, those rules were simply common sense. The pagans represent the starkest contrast. They provide no formal patches for women and maintain no formal system for recognizing old lady status. According to the same 2009 Quinn and Forsyth academic study that documented the Hells Angels and Outlaws property patch systems, pagans do not provide any patches for women at all. What protection a woman has in that world comes entirely from the specific member she is with and his standing inside the chapter. If his standing is high, her protection is real. If his standing is low, her position is equally uncertain. But here is what cuts across all of these differences. Regardless of which club or which chapter, the former PBOL who documented her experience put it plainly. The outlaw biker women are very much second-class citizens in that testosterone-driven life. Everyone knows that. The designation changes between clubs. The patches change, the titles change, but the fundamental position of the woman inside that world does not. Sweet butts and house mice. Every hierarchy has a bottom in the world. Of outlaw motorcycle clubs, the hierarchy of women is no different. Above the old lady, there is nobody. Below her, there are two categories that most outsiders have never heard of. They are called sweet butts and house mice. And the distance between those two categories and the old lady above them is not just social. It is structural, and it defines the experience of every woman who moves through the edges of that world without the protection of a property patch. A sweet butt is a woman who associates with the club without being committed to any single member. She is present at events, at parties, at the clubhouse. She is known to the members and accepted in the spaces where the club gathers. But she does not belong to anyone in the way that an old lady belongs to her man. Therefore, she is available to any member who wants her company, and she has no standing inside the organization that would protect her from that availability. Academic research on outlaw motorcycle club culture has documented the term consistently across multiple clubs and multiple decades. She is not a member. She is not an old lady. She occupies a category that exists below both, and the terms of that category are defined entirely by the club rather than by her. But here is what makes the sweet butt category more complicated than it appears from the outside. Some women in that position are there by choice. They understand the terms of the arrangement and have made a deliberate decision to participate in club life on those terms. Others arrive at that position through a gradual process of involvement that accelerates before they fully understand what they have agreed to. The club world does not always make those distinctions clear to the women moving through it. The house mouse is a term used within the culture to describe a woman who lives with a club member or at the clubhouse in exchange for performing domestic work, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the space where the club gathers. What defines her position is the exchange at its center. She provides domestic labor. In return, she has a place to stay and a degree of proximity to the club, without the formal recognition that comes with the old lady designation. The specifics of this arrangement vary by club and by chapter, and the term itself is not as uniformly documented across clubs as the sweet butt designation is. What connects both categories to the old lady above them is the same thing that connects every position in the outlaw motorcycle club world. The patch is everything. The closer a woman is to a patch, the more protection she has. The further she is from one, the more exposed she is. And the women who understand that dynamic before they enter that world are the ones who navigate it most successfully. The ones who do not understand it until after they are already inside it are the ones whose stories tend to end in ways the club never has to answer for. 7. The rules she has to follow. There is no written handbook for old ladies in outlaw motorcycle clubs. No formal document that lays out what is expected of her, what she is permitted to do, and what she is absolutely forbidden from doing. But the rules exist nonetheless. They are transmitted through observation, through correction, and through the examples set by the women who came before her. And they are enforced with the same consistency that every other rule in that world is enforced. Not always loudly, not always visibly, but consistently. The first rule is silence. What she hears inside the club world stays inside the club world. She will hear things, she will see things, she will be present in environments where information moves around her that law enforcement would consider valuable and that rivals would consider actionable. If any of that information leaves her mouth in the wrong direction, the consequences do not fall only on her. They fall on her man and through him on the chapter. Therefore, silence is not just a personal virtue in that world. It is a structural requirement. The second rule is distance. When a member approaches her man for a private conversation, she is expected to remove herself before anyone has to ask her to. The best old ladies, as described by members across multiple clubs and multiple decades, are the ones who begin moving the moment they see a brother approaching with something on his mind. She does not wait to be excused. She does not linger at the edge of earshot. If she has to be told to move, she has already failed the test. The third rule is visibility on the club's terms. She attends events when her presence is expected, and she does not attend events where her presence has not been invited. She does not show up at the clubhouse unannounced. She does not insert herself into situations where the club is conducting its business. But when she is expected to be present, she is present, and she conducts herself in a way that reflects well on her man and on the chapter. The fourth rule is that she does not interfere in club business. If she has a problem with a decision the club has made about her man's time, his obligations, or his future inside the organization, she raises it with him privately and accepts his decision about how to handle it. She does not go around him to other members. She does not make her disagreement visible in any space where club members can observe it. A woman who is seen to be pulling her man away from his obligations to the club is a liability. And liabilities in that world tend to be removed. But here is what makes these rules genuinely complicated for the women living under them. None of them are ever stated clearly at the beginning. A woman entering that world for the first time learns the rules the way most things are learned in MC culture, by watching what happens to people who break them, by the quiet correction that follows a misstep, by the shift in atmosphere that tells her she has done something wrong before anyone has to explain what it was. The learning curve is steep, and the consequences of getting it wrong fall on the person she is trying to support rather than on herself. Therefore, the pressure to learn fast and learn correctly is not abstract. It is immediate, and it is personal. She is accountable for his patch. In most relationships, the conduct of one partner is considered separate from the standing of the other. A man whose girlfriend embarrasses herself at a work function does not lose his job because of it. A woman whose husband makes a poor impression at a social event does not lose her friendships because of it. The two people are connected, but they are evaluated independently. That is not how it works in an outlaw motorcycle club. In the MC world, she is accountable for his patch in the same way he is accountable for it. Not officially, not in any written rule or formal club document, but in practice, in the way that the club observes and evaluates everything that touches a member's standing. Her conduct during his prospect period can determine whether he patches in at all. The prospect period is the most vulnerable time in a member's journey toward full patch. He is being evaluated constantly. Every decision he makes, every obligation he fulfills or fails to fulfill, every interaction he has with full patch members is being observed and assessed. What most prospects do not fully communicate to the women in their lives is that the evaluation extends to her as well. The club is not just watching him. It is watching everything around him, and the woman he brings to events, the way she carries herself, the way she speaks to other members and their old ladies, the way she handles the restrictions and the long absences and the demands that the prospect period places on both of them. All of it factors into the assessment of whether he is ready for the patch. A prospect whose old lady complains openly about how much time the club takes. A prospect whose old lady asks questions she should not be asking. A prospect whose old lady creates tension with another member's old lady at a run. All of these things become marks against him in an evaluation process that he may not even know is tracking them. The club does not hold a formal meeting to discuss his girlfriend's behavior, but the members notice. And what members notice eventually reaches the officers. And what reaches the officers eventually affects the vote. But the accountability does not end when he patches in. If anything, it deepens. Because once he is a full patch member, his old lady is now a reflection of the chapter itself, rather than just of him as an individual. Her conduct at events involving other chapters, at runs where members from across the organization are present, at any gathering where the chapter's reputation is visible, carries weight that it did not carry before he received his full colors. The standards do not relax after the patch. They expand. Therefore, what it actually means to support a man through the MC world is not simply to be loyal and patient and present. It is to understand that her conduct is never entirely her own business. It belongs to him and through him to the club. Every old lady who has navigated that world successfully has understood that fact early and accepted it completely. And every old lady who has struggled in that world has usually discovered it later than she should have, after the cost of not understanding it had already been paid. What happens to her if he dies or gets expelled? In the outlaw motorcycle club world, there are two ways a member's relationship with his club ends. He dies wearing the patch, or he loses it. And the consequences of those two outcomes for the woman attached to him are so different from each other that they might as well be describing two entirely separate worlds. If he dies as a patched member in good standing, the club takes care of her. That is not a sentiment. It is a practice that has been documented consistently across multiple clubs and multiple decades. The funeral is a club event. The chapter turns out in full. The financial obligations he left behind are addressed. The old lady of a fallen member in good standing does not get abandoned by the organization the morning after the burial. She becomes the responsibility of the chapter in a way that reflects the seriousness with which the club treats the bond between its members. She may not remain an old lady in the formal sense once he is gone, but she retains a status and a connection to the club world that the death of her man does not erase. But if he loses the patch, the situation is entirely different. Expulsion from an outlaw motorcycle club is not a resignation. It is not a mutual parting of ways. It is a removal that happens on the club's terms and carries consequences that extend to everyone connected to the expelled member. His patches are taken. His tattoos may be removed or covered forcibly depending on the club and the circumstances of the expulsion. His name is no longer spoken in the clubhouse in the same way it was spoken before, and the woman who was his old lady ceases to be an old lady the moment the club makes its decision. That loss is total and immediate. The property patch comes off. The protection it represented disappears with it. The relationships she had built with other old ladies, the social world she had constructed inside the club community, the standing she had earned through years of loyalty and discretion, all of it is tied to his patch rather than to her. And when the patch goes, it takes everything with it. Therefore, the position of old lady is fundamentally different from any civilian relationship in one critical respect. In a civilian relationship, a woman's social standing, her friendships, her community connections exist independently of her partner. If the relationship ends, she keeps what she built. In the MC world, she keeps nothing that was not hers before she arrived. Everything she accumulated inside that world was borrowed against his patch. And borrowed things have to be returned. But here is what makes the expulsion scenario particularly complicated. The reason for the expulsion matters enormously to what comes after it. A member expelled for a serious rules violation, for cooperating with law enforcement, for stealing from the club, for any of the acts that the club considers unforgivable, takes his old lady status down with him in a way that can carry social consequences beyond just the loss of standing. She knew him. She was close to him. She may have heard things or seen things that the club now has reason to be concerned about. The shift from protected old lady to potential liability can happen faster than she understands it is happening. If he cooperates with law enforcement, the situation becomes more dangerous still. The history of outlaw motorcycle club prosecutions is full of cases where the wives and girlfriends of cooperating members were pressured, threatened, and in some cases harmed as a way of reaching the man who had turned. The property patch that once protected her becomes a target the moment her man becomes a threat to the organization. And the club that once enforced her protection now has reasons of its own to ensure she does not add to the damage her man has already done. 10. What happens when she wants to leave? Leaving a biker is not the same as leaving a civilian relationship. In a civilian relationship, the mechanics of separation are painful but straightforward. Two people who were together are no longer together. They divide what they shared, they grieve what they lost, and they rebuild separately. The world around them may have opinions about what happened, but it has no formal stake in the outcome. Nobody outside the relationship has a vote on whether the separation is permitted or what the terms of it should be. In the MC world, it is more complicated than that, because she is not just leaving a man, she is leaving a position inside an organization that has its own interests in the terms of her departure. The complication begins with what she knows. An old lady who has been with a patched member for any significant length of time has accumulated information. She has been present at events. She has heard conversations. She has seen faces and known names and understood connections that exist between people the club would prefer remained invisible to anyone outside it. In a civilian relationship, that accumulated knowledge is simply part of what two people share over time. In the MC world, it is a security concern. Therefore, when she decides she wants to leave, the club's response to that decision is shaped not just by how her man feels about it, but by what the club calculates she represents as a departing figure. If the relationship ended quietly and the separation is clean, and she has no reason to talk to anyone about what she knows, the club may allow the departure to proceed without interference. But if the relationship ended badly, if she is angry, if she has threatened to talk, if she has already spoken to people she should not have spoken to, the calculation changes entirely. Former old ladies who have spoken publicly about leaving that world describe a consistent pattern. The pressure applied to them was rarely direct in its early stages. It came through social channels first. Friends who stopped calling, mutual acquaintances who delivered messages without being asked to. A sense that the world she had been part of was closing around her in ways she could feel, but not always see. The directness of the pressure increased in proportion to how much the club believed she represented a genuine threat to its interests. But here is what many women entering that world do not understand until they are already trying to leave it. The information she carries is not the only leverage the club has. She may have children with him. She may have financial entanglements that run through club-connected businesses. She may have friends and family members whose safety she is aware could be affected by decisions she makes. The club does not need to threaten her directly to make the cost of certain choices very clear. The architecture of her life inside that world was built in ways that make departure complicated by design, even when no specific threat is ever made. Therefore, the women who leave that world most successfully are typically the ones who plan their departure the way the club plans its operations, quietly, carefully, without announcing their intentions before they are ready to act on them, without leaving trails that can be followed back to where they are going, without giving the organization time to respond to a decision it has not yet been told has been made. The ones who announce their intention to leave and then remain in proximity to that world while the departure is negotiated are the ones whose stories tend to become the most complicated. It is a world that is easier to enter than it is to exit, and the terms of entry rarely make that fact clear. 11. Children inside the club world. In April 2015, 9 people were killed and 18 wounded in a shooting and stabbing at a Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco, Texas. The incident involved members of the Bandidos and the Cossacks motorcycle clubs and became one of the most documented outlaw biker confrontations in American history. What received less attention in the coverage that followed was something a journalist noted in the parking lot footage from that day. Several of the men who walked into that restaurant were accompanied by family members. Some of those family members were children. That detail captured something true about the outlaw motorcycle club world that most coverage of it misses entirely. It is not a world that exists separately from family life. For many of the men inside it, and for the women attached to them, the club and the family occupy the same space. Children grow up inside that world, not on its edges, but at its center. And what that means for those children is something the club world itself rarely discusses openly. The sons of patched members occupy a specific and documented position in outlaw motorcycle club culture. In some clubs, that position has a formal name. The Hells Angels have historically referred to the sons of members as hangarounds from birth, a designation that places them at the beginning of the same pipeline that adult recruits enter when they begin the process of working toward full patch membership. The son of a member does not start as a stranger to the organization. He starts as a known quantity, someone the club has been watching since before he was old enough to understand he was being watched. By the time he is a teenager, the expectations around him are already forming. If his father is in good standing, the son carries that standing as a kind of inherited credit. Members who might otherwise pay little attention to a young man on the edges of the club world pay attention to him. He is given proximity to club events and club spaces that an unconnected young man would never be offered. He learns the culture, the language, the hierarchy, and the rules through observation and proximity before he is ever formally asked to commit to any of them. But if his father loses the patch, the inherited credit reverses. A son whose father was expelled for a serious rules violation does not carry the same standing as the son of a member in good standing. The sins of the father travel downward in that world in ways that have no civilian equivalent. And the son who grew up expecting to follow his father into the organization may find that the path he assumed was open has closed in ways that have nothing to do with his own conduct. For the daughters of members, the situation is different but no less shaped by the club world they grew up in. They are not on the membership pipeline in the way that sons are, but they are known figures in a world that has long memories and that values the connections between families almost as much as it values the connections between members. A daughter of a senior member carries a status in the social world of the club that shapes how she is treated by members and their families in ways she may not fully understand until she is old enough to recognize the pattern. Therefore, children in that world are never simply children. They are extensions of their father's patch in the same way that old ladies are extensions of their man's patch. What former members who left that world and took their families with them describe most consistently is not the danger or the violence or the legal exposure. It is the disorientation of raising children who were shaped by that world and then having to help them understand a different one. Children who learned silence as a survival skill before they learned how to read. Children who understood hierarchy and loyalty and the consequences of betrayal before they understood almost anything else. The club world does not let go of the people it raises inside it simply because those people eventually leave it. It stays in them, and in the children it produced, long after the patch is gone. The reality versus the mythology. In 2008, a television show called Sons of Anarchy premiered on FX. It ran for 7 seasons, attracted millions of viewers, and became one of the most watched cable dramas in American television history. It also became, for an entire generation of people who had never had any contact with outlaw motorcycle club culture, the primary reference point for what that culture looked like. The old ladies in Sons of Anarchy were complex, powerful, and central to the narrative. They made decisions. They exercised influence. They shaped the direction of the club in ways that the men around them could not always control. That version of the old lady bears almost no resemblance to what the documented reality looks like. The gap between the mythology and the reality of women in outlaw motorcycle clubs has been studied, documented, and described by researchers, former members, and law enforcement professionals for decades. And what that documentation consistently shows is a picture significantly darker and more constrained than anything a television drama has ever been willing to fully portray. The academic research is unambiguous on the core point. Women in outlaw motorcycle clubs do not exercise the kind of influence the mythology suggests. The 2009 Quinn and Forsyth study that documented the property patch system also documented the broader social position of women in that world. They are not members. They do not vote. They do not attend church, which is the term used inside the club world for the formal meetings, where decisions are made. They do not have standing to raise grievances through club channels. They exist in a parallel structure that runs alongside the club without intersecting with its actual decision-making in any formal way. But here is where the reality becomes more complicated than a simple story of oppression allows. Many of the women who have lived inside that world and spoken about it publicly do not describe their experience primarily in terms of victimhood. They describe it in terms of choice. A choice made with varying degrees of information about what it entailed. A choice that some of them would make again and some of them would not. A choice that the mythology romanticizes in one direction and the criticism dismisses in another, with the actual experience of the women who lived it sitting somewhere in the complicated space between. What the mythology gets most wrong is the power dynamic inside a world that formally denies them any. But former old ladies who have spoken on the record about their actual experience describe a power dynamic that looks almost nothing like that. The influence they had was informal, indirect, and entirely dependent on the standing of the man they were attached to. When his standing was high, their informal influence was real but limited. When his standing fell, their influence disappeared entirely. What the mythology also gets wrong is the exit. In Sons of Anarchy, characters leave the club world and return to it and leave again with a frequency that suggests departure is a decision rather than a negotiation. The reality that former old ladies describe is considerably more constrained. Leaving that world is not simply a matter of deciding to go. It is a matter of understanding what leaving means, what it costs, and what it requires in terms of planning and timing and the careful management of information. The women who left that world successfully did not announce their departure. They executed it. What the mythology gets right, almost accidentally, is the loyalty. The old ladies of Sons of Anarchy are loyal to a degree that frequently overrides their own interests and their own safety. That part is accurate. The loyalty that the real MC world demands of the women inside it is total and non-negotiable, and it operates in exactly the way the show depicts it, as something that was not fully explained at the beginning and that reveals its full weight gradually over time as the cost of maintaining it becomes clear. The women who entered that world, understanding what it actually required of them, made a genuinely informed choice about a genuinely difficult life. The women who entered it believing the mythology were making a choice about something that did not exist. And the distance between those two groups, between the women who knew and the women who thought they knew, is where most of the real damage in that world has always been done. The biker world has its own rules for everyone inside it, but the rules that govern the women who enter it are the ones that were never supposed to leave the clubhouse. Now you know them. The biker world has its own rules for everyone inside it, but the rules that govern the women who enter it are the ones that were never supposed to leave the clubhouse. But there are things about biker clubs that go even deeper than this. Things most members spend years learning and outsiders never get to see. Click the next video to see how that unfolds.